Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Rosen Rabini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunello Rosa. This week, we're talking about the complications that the United States faces when fighting two different wars on two different continents. Uh, two key American leaders, President Joe Biden and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, um, made comments on these issues in the last few days. Bernal, could you give us a sort of bird's eye view of some of these comments that were made and the implications of those?
We know that there are two ongoing conflicts, effectively. One, the well-established Russia-Ukraine, in which the US has been involved with plenty of aids to European countries and Ukraine itself. The other is the opening front in Israel, when Israel wants to attack Hamas in Gaza. And there's lots of discussion on whether there should be boots on the ground or a different type of airstrikes and so on and so forth. But there's a bigger question there. Can the US afford to fight two wars at the same time? Well, both Janet Yellen and Joe Biden answers affirmatively to that question and say, of course we can, baby. Biden said, we are the US, for God's sake. So we are the strongest and most powerful country in history, not just in the world. And Janet Yellen said, yeah, no worries. We have the budget to do so. And so we will continue doing so. But of course, there are legitimate questions on whether this is the case or not. And that's why we discussed this into our newsletter.
Absolutely. I mean, looking back at history, is history a guide for these things? Has the US done this before?
Yeah, of course. As usual, when you don't know the answer to something, a good guidance could come from history. And the US has fought multiple wars at the same time. First of all, during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, which had its own budget, as we know, the nuclear arms race and so on and so forth. The US was fighting first the war in Korea from 50 to 53, and then the well-known war in Vietnam that lasted from the beginning in 1955 to the end in 1975, almost 20 years. And then more recently, the US has fought at the same time in Iraq and then in Afghanistan following the Twin Towers terrorist attacks. So the US has a history in fighting not on one front but on two fronts. And let's not forget the mother, would say, of the two fronts battles, which is World War II itself, where the US were fighting on the Western Front, effectively Europe, and then on the Eastern Front, let's call it that way, in the Pacific against Japan. So the US has definitely the capability and the finances to fight two wars at the same time, at least historically speaking.
Yeah. I mean, a critic might listen to that and say, sure, the US has the military and perhaps the strategic capacity to engage in two wars, but the world has changed and the global financial system has changed significantly. Does the US still have, would you say, the sort of monetary and fiscal capabilities to not take a kind of existential hit whilst fighting these two wars sustainably?
Yes, the US has the still today the capability of doing so, but let's not forget also in this case history. True, the US could fight the Cold War and the Vietnam War at the same time, but not without a price. In 1973, France was in fact a bit scared that the US could not repay its debt, and so he asked the conversion of his gold reserves into um, dollars. So effectively, they said, "Okay, I got these dollars. Please give me back my gold reserves." And the US said, "Oh, sorry." End of the convertibility. This was what marked the collapse of the Bretton Woods system under Nixon, which in itself was the beginning of the modern era of globalization because lots of other things happened at the same time with the return of Deng Xiaoping in China and so on and so forth. But at that time, it was a bit of a shock. So wars do have huge financial implications. And so the risk is that, as in 1973, the Vietnam War determined a massive regime change, regime shifts in global financial markets, this could happen again in this case. And we see that investors have been worried recently by the rise of the fiscal deficit and the public debt in the US. And that's why they've been asking much higher returns to hold US Treasury, which, at the 10-year yield, and the 10-year has already reached 5% plus.
Absolutely. I mean, beyond the 10-year US Treasury yield, the 30-year US Treasury yield has reached 5.08%. And these are levels that we haven't seen since the last financial crisis. And so, beyond this, there's various others, perhaps domestic problems that in some direct way might be affected by this increased defense spending. We have to remember that, these aren't just external threats, they pose indirect internal ones. So certainly something we'll watch sort of in the months to come. But as always, Brunel, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Until next time.